Hi everyone. This will be a different video than my usual visual novel devlog update videos. I've just had this topic on my mind for a while and I thought I should make a video about it. This video will be about choices in visual novels, as well as things related to visual novel choices, such as required replaying. I'll just be sharing my thoughts. This is my opinion. I like making visual novels and don't really want to be a critic. At the same time, though, I feel like some fellow visual novel creators might appreciate my thoughts on this topic, and might even be looking for some advice about it. I think people ask about this topic relatively frequently, so I might as well make a video about it. In this video, I'll be talking about some game design decisions, about choices that take me out of the story and frustrate me, and talk about how I think the situations could be changed to be more immersive or simply result in better player experiences. It's also important to note that I tend to read romance visual novels, or at least visual novels that aren't centered around combat. This video in part does focus on bad endings, but bad endings related to like combat or physical prowess aren't really going to be touched upon. I've broken this video up into 4 or 5 sections, so let's just start with Section 1, quiz-like visual novels. Every now and then I like taking an online quiz. It can be really fun to see what the result of the quiz would be. It can also be quite interesting from a game design perspective to put a quiz of some sort into your visual novel. What I mean when I talk about quiz-like visual novels is visual novels which have choices that lead the player to a predestined outcome based on their previous choices, rather than giving the player an explicit choice when it comes time to go down a specific path. In other words, judging from the reader's previous choices, the game programmer assumes that the player would like to or should go down a certain section of story without the reader's explicit say so. When done well, this can be rather seamless and natural. When done poorly, this can be very frustrating, as the player may get locked into a path they had no desire to go down, as the visual novel didn't give them a clear choice of where to go, and they feel strung along and helpless as they go somewhere they don't want to go. So each section will have 2 examples each. One example doing things the way I feel is more proper, and one doing things in a largely improper way, in my opinion. So let's look at example 1 here. In example 1, the player has quite a few choices to choose from. Having more choices in a quiz results in that quiz having a more accurate outcome, and results in any individual quiz answer having little weight in its own right, not radically changing the outcome of the quiz on its own. So let's take a look. On day 1, the player can choose to either go fishing, play video games, or walk in the park. Each of these are coded to a heroine. Let's say there are 3 heroines. Let's call them Fisher, Gamer, and Walker for convenience. Let's say you choose playing video games. This naturally results in the gamer getting a point. At the end of the quiz, if a girl has more points than the others, the player will end up with her. A very simple structure. Let's say on day 2 you choose to go to the art gallery, or you can go to a nearby mountain, or you can go snorkeling. This is the choice that you have. The outcome of this choice may be less obvious to the player. Let's say that the gamer meets you on top of the mountain, Walker likes to snorkel, and Fisher is looking at art in the art gallery. This choice can teach you more about the girls and their personalities, and perhaps show you that you have more in common with a girl that you didn't previously expect to have things in common with, if you didn't say like gaming, for example. So let's say between these 3 choices you choose to climb the mountain. When you get to the top of the mountain, Gamer is there helping a friend with some things who happens to live on top of the mountain. So Gamer gets 1 point. This goes on for several days. Walker is out on a jog, Gamer is drawing up some game designs, Fisher is out on the water again. Let's say that this goes on for about 6 days. And let's say at the end of the 6 days, Gamer ends up with 4 points. So with 4 out of 6 points, you end up going down Gamer's path. Now let's change it up. Let's say Gamer ends up with 6 points out of 6. Maybe you go down a special version of Gamer's path because you have so much in common. Now let's change things up again. Let's say that everyone, because 6 is an even number, ends up with 2 points. Maybe when everyone's tied or something like that, you go down a path where you're friends with everyone but don't end up with anyone romantically, something like that. In this example 1, you may have been surprised by the result of some of the choices, but in the end, if you and Gamer have the same general hobbies, you wouldn't really be surprised that you end up going down her route. And if in the end you have a fairly even spread, you wouldn't really be surprised at the friendship route either. Now let's look at example 2. Let's keep the heroines the same, so there's Gamer, Fisher, and Walker. In this example, you only have 3 sets of choices, not 6. First thing is, you're getting something from the store, let's say. You can get either celery, cake, or steak. Let's say you choose cake. Well, as it turns out, Gamer likes cake, so Gamer gets 1 point. Now let's say you have some free time, and you can either read, or watch a movie, or play with the class pet. And let's say you choose to read. Well, reading is a solitary activity that nobody joins you in, and is treated as a neutral choice. So even if you like reading, it doesn't count for anything in this situation. Lastly, what do you do before you go to bed? Do you go for a night walk? Do you set off some fireworks? Or do you do some cleaning? Let's say you choose to set off some fireworks. It turns out Fisher loves fireworks, so Fisher gets 1 point. Well, those were all your choices. You ended up picking one neutral answer, got 1 point for Gamer, and got 1 point for Fisher. As a result, the protagonist feels he doesn't fit into society and ends up getting lost in the woods and getting killed by a bear. This outcome is insane. You might think I'm exaggerating with this example, but this is actually very close to an experience I had with a visual novel recently. It's actually what made me want to make this video. This sort of outcome is outrageous and has nothing to do with the player's actual choices. The player would never choose to go into the forest and get killed by a bear. But instead of allowing the player any real agency, the programmer decided to go with the neutral outcome of a harsh quiz that didn't have enough choices. This sort of thing can really get to a player and can forcefully pull them out of an experience, especially if it comes late in the story. Visual novels are not like regular novels. You can read a tragic novel and it will be depressing, but in the back of your mind, you'll know that the depressing ending was what the author had in mind. And the only fault of yours was deciding to pick up their book and stick with it. But visual novels with choices give the players enough agency to feel like they're guilty when something bad happens, even if it wasn't their fault. The players start to think it was their fault for making the choices that they did. But no matter how you cut it, the players shouldn't have died from deciding to set off fireworks. Unless the fireworks exploded or something, which isn't what happened. The player tries to wrap their mind around it, asking themselves things like, what did I do wrong, and what could I have done better? But in the second example, the choices felt quite random. The player ends up feeling like they're in a world governed by chaos rather than order. So I think we have a responsibility to write our choices responsibly. We don't want our players to get invested in our world, characters, and stories, sometimes for hours, only to get killed by a bear without feeling like they deserved it in any way. In the end, even though the player isn't given a true choice in that example, the protagonist makes a radical choice. If the protagonist is about to make some type of radical choice, then the player needs to be able to make an actual choice, then and there, to pull the protagonist out of a potential nosedive. That way they can avoid the tragedy. And if they choose to not avoid the tragedy, at least they'll have a clear memory of a choice that they made that specifically impacted the outcome, and they could reload and make another choice. But without a clear choice, you as the player have a first-person perspective of dying in an undeserved plane crash, and it feels terrible, especially when you did nothing to deserve it. This sort of thing is obvious, and should be obvious to a lot of people, but it seems like sometimes people need to hear this. Now let's go back to the first example. The neutral ending was relatively harmless. If Fisher and Walker and Gamer each got 2 points, the player ended up going down a route where they were friends with all of them, which seems much more appropriate than having the character die. In the second example, if you had chosen to clean instead of set off fireworks, you would have met Gamer, gotten another point for her, and would have started going down her route. In general, the outcome of the second example was very disproportionate, and the player didn't realize they were actually making a choice between life and death. So I'll conclude the quiz section. Quizzes can be fun, but many of the choices should be fairly clear, and the quiz should end up being adequately long. Also, I think we should be pretty lenient with our players. I don't think one neutral sounding choice over another should end up with protagonist death, for example. I think the player should be given a lot of chances to get down a proper path, or even to just go down a neutral path that isn't so negative. And if the protagonist is about to do something radical, the player should have some actual say in it. It's as simple as that. I was playing another visual novel where the protagonist was getting to know 2 girls, and it was another thing like this, where it was a quiz sort of situation or a micro choices sort of situation, where I guess there was a love meter filling up in the background for each character. But if the love meter just wasn't high enough, even if you were just picking normal choices that weren't like outrageously negative or anything, just choices that an actual person would make, the protagonist decides in the end, well, I'm just going to move away and not be with anyone. It wasn't any of the characters like rejecting him. It wasn't a choice that the player made. If the player was just given a choice between one of the 2 girls, they probably would have chosen one of them instead of just had the player character just move away. So I definitely think that the player should actually have a choice if the protagonist character is just going to do something radical that the player had no idea that they were going to do. It's pretty basic stuff, but seriously, some people do this. I guess that leads me into section 2, micro choices. Like I said earlier, this is similar to the quiz section. Micro choices in visual novels tend to fill up love meters with the characters. The player makes a bunch of little choices frequently, and in the end, the hero or heroine with the highest love score is the one the reader goes down the route of. That sort of thing. As described in the quiz section, I don't really have an issue with this in concept. But like in the quiz section, this can be done well or this can be done poorly. Like before, let's take a look at a positive and negative example. Let's say that this is a dating game and the heroes are Brad, Rob, and Al. So let's take a look at example 1. After I get some water, be right back. Example 1. Let's say you're talking with Brad. You can say something he'll like, something he'll dislike, or something that he'll be neutral about. Here are your options. You can either say, I like guitars, music isn't really my thing, or I hate music. These options are clear and simple, and you can probably tell right away which one he'll like, which one he won't like, and which one he'll be neutral to. It seems, even from judging by this minimal context, that Brad likes music. It doesn't need to be this obvious, but having a general understanding of what someone will react positively or negatively to can be very helpful, as you'll see later. Let's say you tell him that you aren't really big on music. He says something like, well, to each their own, and the game goes on. Let's say you have 20 micro choices like this, as they're made pretty often. When I'm talking about micro choices, I'm pretty much talking about small choices that are made very frequently to sort of simulate social dynamics. So let's say you have 19 more of these sets of choices, and all of them are pretty similar to these. Once again, at the end, you aren't super surprised by the outcome. And by the way, I'll go on a tangent here because I don't have this in the script, but having something that's a surprise isn't necessarily a bad thing. But especially when you're trying to be in a romance story and trying to understand who people are, having consistency is kind of necessary. Having logic is kind of necessary. If it was not a romance story, if it was some sort of adventure story, or something of that nature, like a time travel thing, or an action game of some kind, or a game where you're exploring different places or something like that, the unexpected could be probably a positive thing. And I'm not trying to say that you need to exactly know what's going to happen all of the time, even in a romance story. You can be surprised by things. But I just don't think that the surprise should be a negative one. The ultimate goal of a romance story is probably to end up being in an emotionally healthy relationship with someone. So having internal inconsistency with what your choices are and what the choices result in is sort of like talking to a bunch of people that have like mental disorders, like bipolar disorders or schizophrenia or something like that, where you don't know how they'll react to one thing or anything. Whereas with an adventure or something, you don't really have a particular goal in mind, like being with someone in a romantic relationship. The goal of an adventure is to have an adventure. So having an unexpected outcome is like, hey, more adventure. But when it comes to romance, there's a very clear thing that you're aiming for, and if the programmer is like, surprise, you screwed it up, well, that's different. So let's get back to the example here. Let's say all the micro choices are relatively similar to this. Once again, you aren't super surprised with the outcome. It turns out at the end of this that you have more things in common with Rob, and end up going down his route rather than Brad's or Al's. But Brad, Rob, and Al are all pretty cool guys, and even if you weren't expecting to go down Rob's route, you got to know him over the last few days in game, and are fine with going down his route. So let's switch things up in this example. Let's say your character instead managed to upset everyone. Let's say at the end of 20 micro choices, Brad had -3 love, Rob had -10 love, and Al has -7. At that point, I don't think the player would be terribly surprised to end up in the woods getting attacked by a bear. I think, though, that a bad ending like that should only be reserved for really bad scores. If instead Brad had a score of 1, Rob had a score of 3, and Al had a score of 2, for example, then I don't think those scores should necessarily be low enough to justify such a terrible ending that includes character death. I think in that scenario there could be a neutral ending. Or perhaps the player would go down Rob's route, as he would have had the highest score and the scores would have been in the positive, with Rob having a score of 3. Now let's take a look at how this could be done poorly. Example 2. The game has just started. Right away you have a micro choice with someone you as the player know nothing about. There has been no setup, and you don't know any of the social dynamics or where your character stands with anyone. You're talking to Brad, and have these 3 choices. Either, don't worry too much, or, wow, you sure know how to charm a girl, or, I can do it on my own. For a while, you look over the choices and wonder what they could mean. You think, I can do it on my own sounds kind of rude. You also think, wow, you sure know how to charm a girl, might be the character being sarcastic to Brad and putting him down. So after a while, you reason that you should pick Don't Worry Too Much. It seems like the most sensible option considering you have no context. But as it turns out, Brad takes this as a personal attack and says something like, I'm not worrying too much. Why don't you let me do something nice for you? So, being as you didn't mean to leave him with that impression, you reload the saved game and choose another option. You end up choosing, wow, you sure know how to charm a girl. It turns out this choice wasn't sarcastic at all, and he takes it really well. He says something like, ha, I'm glad you appreciate it. And soon after, your character says something like, I do appreciate it, but don't push yourself too much for me, okay? I don't want you to overdo it. Even though that was the option you initially picked, Brad takes that comment well in this context. And he says something like, yeah, I know. Thanks. But you shouldn't worry too much yourself. I'll be fine. Let's say again there are 20 choices like this, and they're all like this. What was that? You end up doing mental gymnastics, trying to assume relationships between characters, figure out sarcasm in a text only game, and trying to figure out which tiny answer might be a trigger for someone, or could be seen as a personal attack. On top of that, you were under the impression that the reason you were given a choice in the first place was to say something that you wouldn't otherwise say later, regardless of your decision. If your character goes on to talk about something that you had the option to choose but didn't, then what's the point of a choice? Especially if, when you go out of your way to choose the option to say what you mean to, the characters end up taking it negatively. Whereas if you ignore the obvious choice, your character will say the same thing in a more positive way without your input. It's all nonsense, and it makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells around everyone, not knowing whether or not your choices will actually harm or hinder anything, because you don't know how anyone's going to react to anything. Once again, this isn't an exaggeration. I've had this experience playing a visual novel before, and it drives me crazy. So, to do micro choices like this well, I think you should give the reader time to understand who the characters actually are and figure out their relationships with each other. Have characters that are generally mature and won't bite your head off for saying something a normal person would say. Only give the player a choice to do or say something that wouldn't automatically be done or said later, regardless of the input. I mean, it's supposed to be a choice, after all. Or if you can't do that, at least don't give the player the option to do the negative version of something that would be positive if they didn't choose it. That's backwards logic. And make it clear what all of the choices will mean in the first place, in clear terms that people can understand without trying to guess what the writer's intentions are. Just communicate clearly. Write characters that aren't triggered by nonsense, and give readers the opportunity to build context with your setting, story, and characters. That sort of thing goes a long way. Let's move on to section 3. Letting your players save. This is an easy one, but some people need to hear it, apparently. I've said a few times in this video that it isn't always clear what the writer means by certain choices. Even if you, as the writer, have thought well and long about how to word your choices so that the player can make a choice in an educated way and understand what the consequences are, sometimes people just misclick or aren't thinking straight and end up picking the wrong choice. But also, sometimes a player will just assume that a choice would be considered rude or polite, or vice versa. So, the bottom line is you need to let people save and load their games. You're not being clever, it's just annoying. It's like if you were reading a book and you accidentally flipped to a page that was too far ahead, and the writer of the book shows up and is like, haha, you fell into my trap. You can't flip to the previous page. Do you think that's clever? All it does is make people resentful, if anything, and make people not want to read your book. There's just no need to mess with people's ability to do basic functions that are convenient and that there's nothing wrong with. All it does is frustrate people. That's the end of section 3. It's a short one. Section 4. This is a bigger one. Collecting items before getting a true ending. The concept behind collecting items before you get to a true ending is actually kind of interesting. It can incentivize people to replay visual novels and go on different character paths, spend more time in the setting, and so on. However, this can also be done poorly. Like before, let's take a look at a better example and a worse example. Example 1. You're investigating a mystery. You have your eyes on Kate, Andrew, and Cole. You get to know each of these people. You're getting to know Kate, and Kate has 2 main paths. At the end of one of her paths, you get an item, and even though her path was interesting in its own right, the greater mystery remains unsolved. You reload and go down her second path. In the second path, you get more information, enjoy another story that's interesting in its own right, and get a second item. All Kate's main paths are now done. You might reload and make some minor choices, but you'll see that you don't get any new items, because Kate only had 2 items to offer. And the other choices you make don't have as much impact on the story at all. There are only 2 real story paths in Kate. So you reason that you have to do this now with Andrew and Cole, and you have a pretty good idea of how many items there are to collect. You end up going down Andrew's route and do the same thing. However, it seems like he actually has 3 paths instead of 2. You figure this out among the many choices, because while many of the choices seem superficial, you find 3 that are more important, and which will logically and reasonably lead to different main stories. Not just saying, well, I like pudding rather than cookies, but saying something like, were you on the train that day? Or what happened to your parents? That sort of thing. Figuring out that he has 3 main story paths, you don't mind this, as each path is easy enough to find, and each path is interesting and unique in its own right. Also, as you're reading, you as the reader are starting to understand more and more about the greater mystery. It makes sense that the true ending would be unlocked when the protagonist and the reader both know what's going on in the mystery. You repeat this for Cole, and after enjoying all of the unique stories and routes of the visual novel, you unlock the true ending, which is the answer to the greater mystery. Now let's take a look at a bad example. Example 2. There's the same setup. You're trying to solve a mystery. You have your eyes on Kate, Andrew, and Cole. You go down Kate's route first. There are many small choices, and none of them seem more relevant than the others. You choose whichever small choices you feel like at the time, get to the end of Kate's route, and feel rather satisfied. However, you did notice that the ending wasn't the true one, as it didn't solve the larger mystery. Also, you noticed that after each individual choice, you got an item. Understanding that you are supposed to collect items, you reload and play Kate's route again. You make different choices and get a few more items. However, regardless of your choices, Kate's story stays largely the same. It always resolves the same way, and you only get a brief scene or 2 that are different in any way. Maybe you get a scene that was significantly different in there, but things are all pretty much the same and largely end in the same ending. It turns out each character has many items to collect, and it turns out that you have to collect 40 items in total before you can unlock the true ending. You reload and play it again. Again, you go through the same story with minor differences. You already know how each character's route will end after playing each of them once, but you want to solve the greater mystery to get a satisfying conclusion, so you keep on reloading. After a while, you stop reading the text. It just becomes a grind. You go into the settings so that you can skip through text more easily because it's all just the same. You get frustrated. You start to wonder, which choices have I made so far? Should I be writing this down? You accidentally end up redoing some of the choices that you've made earlier and getting no items for your trouble, because it's hard to figure out where you've been and everything looks the same, and is largely the same. After way too long, you stumble through the finish line and you get the true ending. But you're so tired that you can hardly enjoy it. And it's a short ending anyway. It wasn't worth the slog. Again, this isn't an exaggeration. This largely happened to me when I played a certain visual novel. So let's break down what went right in the first example and what to avoid. First of all, the first example had far fewer items to collect in the first place, with only 7 total, not 40. The collectibles in the first example were also easy to find, and getting each item represented you as the player getting one step closer to solving the mystery. Each time you got one, you had just finished a unique story that gave you a unique experience and taught you more about the character's world and setting, and story. There were few enough choices and items to keep track of things in your head, and the number of items you had to collect wasn't intimidating. Each ending was satisfying in its own right, and each meaningful choice led down a unique story path. The endings didn't repeat over and over and over again. That said, even though each of the endings was satisfying in its own right, you still had the desire to know more because you didn't know the full mystery. Getting the items and replaying the visual novel was used as a way to engage the reader. In the second example, the player goes numb. After a while, they didn't care about the story because so much of it was the same, and they were just going through it over and over again to collect items. And even when the true ending was reached, it didn't undo the time that was wasted. Even if the true ending was well written, the path to get there was obnoxious and tiring. The player also didn't know where they had been and where they hadn't been, because so much of it was the same. When writing visual novels like this, ask yourself, why am I wanting a player to collect these items? It should probably be to allow the player to get more invested in your world and more invested in your characters. And if that's the case, then ask yourself, how many items should there be? And does each hero or heroine need so many? Or do they just need a few? It can be tempting to have an item after literally every individual choice, but if the story paths are all so similar, or there simply are too many choices to keep track of, then try to be honest with yourself. You probably don't need so many. At any rate, you shouldn't have to collect 30 or 40 items. Let's move on to section 5. How do I get a satisfying ending? You may be able to tell that this is similar in ways to the collecting items section. Sometimes the first playthrough of a visual novel will only ever result in you getting a bad ending, and the true ending is meant to come later, which is meant to be the satisfying ending. This can be tricky, because if the player makes every choice to the best of their ability, they can feel cheated if the best that they can do is an unsatisfying ending. Let's take a look at 2 examples. Example 1. Let's say our heroines are Emily, Christy, and Lexa, and you go down Emily's route. There are quite a few choices to make on Emily's route, but you do your best to avoid loose state endings, and reach what you feel is the truest ending of her route. While that ending is somewhat satisfying, you can tell that there's more to the story. After you get that ending, you see a faded photo of Emily's face. It lights up, signifying that you did a good job. Then you're sent back to the start screen. You think, okay, and go down another girl's route. You do the same thing with Christy and Alexa. Once all 3 of the photos have lit up, the true ending begins. That's how I think it could be done well. Let's look at example 2. Once again, let's say you're going down Emily's route. There are many choices. Some are simple loose state endings. Others are endings which might be considered good. You aren't really sure. You do your best to navigate to what you believe is the true ending of Emily's route, or at least the truest ending that you can get to. When you get there, a character appears and laughs at the main character, mocking them for their efforts. Soon after, the route ends in an unsatisfying way. No information is given to the player. They're not sure if they've done something right or wrong, and they're sent back to the start screen. Now, what just happened? You, as the player, end up feeling like you were mocked for your efforts, and feel like the writers didn't really appreciate the time and effort that you spent getting invested in their world and characters. You aren't completely sure you got Emily's truest ending, as there was no indicator, and some of the other endings could have also been considered good endings. There isn't even any indication that anything needs to be unlocked or that you did it right. The ending wasn't satisfying and you didn't get to the greater story. But since you don't know if anything's unlocked, you don't know how to proceed. You were simply going down Emily's route up until this point, and having apparently reached the best conclusion of it, without any feedback, you don't know how to proceed with the game. You could try to get a better Emily ending, maybe you didn't get the right one. But you did your best, and got mocked for your troubles. You could go down the route of one of the other girls, but you don't even know if you were successful with Emily. And even if you were, you don't want to go down hours of further investment just to get insulted again. And even setting that aside, the game has a lot of paths and it's quite complicated. Are you even thinking about this the right way? Are you supposed to go down each heroine's path, or is it like a maze with one exit? How are you to know? You've been given no information. Well, being as the game insulted you and sent you back to the main menu, without any instruction on what to do, and leaving you feeling kind of frustrated and unsatisfied, you end up just turning the game off. You figure you'll play something that isn't rude to you and that doesn't give you a headache. So let's break down what the first example did right to avoid this. The first example really didn't do much different, but what it did different was significant. It made it clear that you were progressing. It also had an ending that was relatively satisfying in its own right. It left you wanting more, but it didn't insult you. And the way that your progress was being made clear helped you know what to do going forward. A portrait of the heroine who you were on the route of lit up. This tells you that you do this 2 more times, once for each heroine, and something would unlock. Again, this example largely happened to me playing a visual novel. The point of me making this video is partially to get some of this stuff off my chest so that I can just move on with my life. But it's also meant to be instructive. I think many people would agree that the first examples in all of these sections are better than the second examples, and I think it's pretty easy to fix things up. I think sometimes we can just be a little bit thoughtless as writers and as visual novel designers. I think we can also forget the player's perspective and forget why we're implementing some of these game mechanics in the first place. Sometimes we have to step back and ask ourselves some questions like, why am I doing this? What do I mean to do with this? What do I mean to get out of it? This makes sense to me, but are things phrased in a confusing way? I know these characters, but does the reader have enough context to make informed choices? And are the choices clear in the first place? Asking yourselves these types of questions can be helpful, and I guess that leads me to the end of the video. That's pretty much all I have to say. I hope you found this relatively instructive. I'm not meaning to insult anyone, really. And there's a reason that I'm not saying the names of the visual novels that I had these negative experiences with. The goal here isn't to put anyone down. The goal here is to help people to hopefully make just generally better decisions when playing with the ideas of quizzes and game mechanics and choices in general when it comes to visual novels. If you want, you can leave a comment. Feel free to share your thoughts with me. And thanks for listening. Now I'm going to go back to making my own visual novel, now that I've gotten this off my chest. I usually post devlog videos on this channel, so if you're interested in seeing what I make, feel free to watch some of the devlog video and follow the development of some of my projects. Well, that's everything. Take care, everyone.